The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
An incomparable voice, a trailblazing artist, an unflinching activist. Tonight, legendary Indigenous singer-songwriter Buffy Sainte-Marie. Then, from our Ontario hubs, why advocates hope tiny houses could help reduce homelessness in Hamilton. And from the war in Ukraine to private delivery of public health care, we've got the agendas we can review. It's Friday, September 16th, and that's all ahead on the agenda. As far back as the Greenwich Village folk scene of the 1960s, the vision and talent of singer-songwriter Buffy Sainte-Marie was unmistakable. She's been a fearless creator ever since, making groundbreaking music, art, and speaking truth to power throughout as a leading Indigenous voice that's never shied away from the hard truths. A new documentary about her life and music premiered this year at TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival, and we're honored that it brings Buffy Sainte-Marie to our airwaves tonight from Ottawa. Hello.
Hi.
We
got a mutual fangirling going here.
I'm sorry. Okay, I will be professional. I will get into the conversation, but it's so nice to meet you. I love the documentary. It's called Carry It On, but it's not the first documentary made about your life. What makes this one so special?
Well, Joan Prouse's documentary, Buffy Sainte-Marie, A Multimedia Life, was really very lovely. But in any documentary, you know, there's only so much time. And so when Madison Thomas, who's a young filmmaker, she's half Indigenous and half other stuff. She's from Manitoba. She's just a brilliant filmmaker. And she and our writer, Andrea Warner, who wrote the biography about me, they had certain ideas. And they, of course, they weren't trying to reference Joan's documentary. They wanted to make it different, and they were able to cover some different things that I've done, and a little bit more time. And times have changed since the first documentary that was made on me. So all of those things. And I've had kind of a big life also. I'm 81, so I've been around for a long time. So there was a lot to choose from. And I'm sure glad that I wasn't the one who decided what was going to go in and what was going to get left out, because it's hard.
81 years young. I want to give the viewers a little peek with this documentary. It starts with a revelation by you that many viewers might find quite shocking. We'll roll the clip and then we'll come back and chat some more.
Okay.
Okay.
As a child, you know, I was told two things that kind of should have ruined me. And the two things are, you can't be a musician. You can't read music. You cannot tell me I can't be a musician just because you don't recognize natural music. And the other thing that I was told is you can't be an Indian. There aren't any more. Oh, there may be a few in Arizona, but no, there aren't any around here.
Those are pretty damning words to hear as an adult, but to hear that at a young age, what kind of impact did that have on you?
Well, as I said in the film, it should have ruined me, but it didn't, because it just made me laugh, because I'd go to school and I wasn't allowed to be in band or chorus or anything because I couldn't read music. I since found out as an adult I'm actually dyslexic in music, the same way Einstein was dyslexic in math. So if you really love it, you find another way. And that's kind of made a positive impact on me, because when they would tell me in school, you can't be in band and you can't be a musician, I just laughed, because I'd go home and I'd play fake Tchaikovsky and anything I heard on the radio just by ear. And that's so different. And when they told me that I couldn't be an Indian, I must be mistaken, I mean, I knew better. I knew better.
How did you know better? How did you know better? Because you were adopted.
Because my mom was part Mi'kmaq. And they knew that I wasn't, they knew that I was Indigenous. They just didn't know what the details were, and I'll probably never know. And, you know, people never think about it, but adopted children, you know, we don't have a real birth certificate. They make something up and then it gets sealed by the court. So, I mean, we don't even get to have a horoscope. We don't know when our real birthday is. So that was kind of the position I was in. I was in a position of people coming from a European education and cultural background who had not been informed. They thought that you learned music from music teachers and writing. No, music existed before all of that. And indigenous people, the world at large, especially in education, they didn't know. The teachers themselves didn't know anything about indigenous people. So it just kind of got left out. But I knew it was real.
You said something that I just want to follow up on. I'm kind of jumping ahead in your life, but you are a mother. You became a mother. And I only asked this question because my husband is adopted. And when we had children, it anchored him in a way. So when you said that, you didn't know where you came from, what was the impact like that for you when you became a mother and you were connected to this one person in a way that can't be taken away or broken?
Well, it was very beautiful, but I didn't really know what to do with the indigenous issue. I didn't know what to tell him, except that his dad is Mdewakanton Sioux, Dakota. And my son, whose name is Dakota, is quite close to his dad. But I was more close to the Paikin family, who took me in my late teens, early 20s. They took me in, and it's not like going to the adoption agency or the shelter and adopting a puppy or a new baby. It's not formalized like that. It's Cree adoption, as Solomon Ratt kindly points out in the documentary. Cree adoption, it's almost like marriage. It's really, you become a part of the family and that's it. You don't need to have papers and stuff. Everybody knows that you're a part of the family. And in my particular case, with the Paikin family, they had lost 2 daughters. And it's their tradition, our tradition, that if that happens to you, you always save a place in your heart to be filled by someone else. And so my sister Brenda was adopted into that family, who already had 3 children. And I was adopted into that family. So it's quite a lovely thing. And it was really healing to me. So when my son was born, he had his own dad, who was Mdewakanton, Dakota. And now he had not only my mom, who raised me part Mi'kmaq, but didn't know anything about it, but also the Paipans, who did know a lot about it.
So let's go back a little bit, back to the 1960s. You're in the folk music scene of Greenwich Village, where Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, Robbie Robertson were all establishing their careers. Was the village a welcoming space for aspiring folk singers, or was it more of a case of survival of the fittest?
Oh, a little bit of both, I think. It certainly was a welcoming place for folk music, but most everybody was singing Woody Guthrie and the American Songbook. This land is your land, this land is my land. How do you think that affected me?
How did it affect you?
This land used to be my land.
How did it affect you?
This land used to be my land, but it isn't anymore. So the American Songbook wasn't my thing. And actually, I had graduated with a degree from the University of Massachusetts in Oriental Philosophy and Religion, and I had a teacher's degree. So I thought I was going to India to continue my studies, but instead I went to Greenwich Village and got famous as what they were calling a folk singer, because that's what they were marketing, the word folk singer. Now, I was a songwriter, and I didn't know folk songs, but I loved them. And for me, it was a wonderful example to be around people who actually were singing songs that were 400 years old, because oh boy, I mean, you can't argue with Greensleeves, I mean, there are great songs if they last, and I wanted to write songs about the human condition, so I fit very well into that folk music genre, even though I wasn't singing mostly folk songs. However, for us who were actually there, I mean, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Judy Collins, these were people who came from mainstream families, business families, Bob Dylan's dad had a store and et cetera. I didn't have any of that. And they were very well protected and highly represented by people like Albert Grossman and, big time shark managers who would just push everybody else out of the way. I mean, I think that Phil Oakes has never gotten his due, and Tom Paxson has never gotten his due, or Len Chandler. There were a lot of us who, we just got elbowed out in order that everybody else could be in the photo ops, and they got forgotten. I didn't get forgotten because I kept going, and because even though I was blacklisted in the US, I had a big career in the rest of the world. I mean, I was in Hong Kong and Australia and all over Canada and Europe. So I didn't really feel the impact of having either been shoved out of the way by people's managers and not welcomed by other artists, or impacted by the blacklisting that was going on in secret. And then
Well,
I didn't know anything about that.
Well, that leads me to my next question, because during the 1960s, you were one of the first public figures to use the word genocide to describe the treatment of Indigenous people in North America. In fact, the Johnson and Nixon administration discouraged, I think the wording in the documentary was, they strongly urged radio stations from playing your songs because of this. How did you stay motivated and not succumb to frustration and anger?
Well, I wish I had a real helpful answer for somebody else who might go through this, but they don't tell you. I didn't know it. It's not as though I outsmarted them. I didn't know it. They don't tell you. It's all done in secret, and it's not done by the US government. When they say the Johnson administration, Democrats, and the Nixon administration, Republicans, it's not as though they pass an act of Congress blacklisting your music, which would be legal. It's all done under the table. A couple of guys go in the back room, they make nasty phone calls and send out letters to the media, and that artist is not played anymore. And none of us knew that was going on. It was called Cointelpro. Businessmen who sponsored these presidents were worried about the Indigenous refusal to surrender even more land to oil and greed and resource extraction. I mean, we were really sticking up for Mother Earth and humanity in general. And what we were opposing was, federal tanks and big banks and heavy politicians and the FBI, and nobody knew about it. Cointelpro was a real thing.
Even in the documentary, we find out that, you lost friends during that movement. And in the process of them trying to silence your music, something else remarkable happened. In the 1970s, you were the first recurring Indigenous person to guest star on Sesame Street. We have a picture of you with Grover, one of my faves. But you were also the first woman to nurse a baby on mainstream national television. How significant was your presence on that show in changing people's perspectives?
I'm told it was very significant. At the time, they wanted me to come on Sesame Street like Stevie Wonder and everybody else and say the alphabet or count from 1 to 10. And I didn't have time for that. I was busy doing other things that keep me busy. So I said, have you ever done any Native American programming? And they said, no. And they called me right back. And they wanted to do it. But it was my idea. You cannot wait for other people to invite you into something that you already know can be great. If you've got the goods, you have to have the balls to stand up and say so.
But how did you know at that time? But how did you know at that time? Because you're not seeing anyone that looks, we're having these conversations right now about the importance of representation. But this wasn't the only time that you did this. Like, you did it for another television show. You were invited and you said, well, if I come on the show, then you have to bring all these Indigenous people. You have to give these people opportunities. But how did you have that voice during that time?
Oh, I was real famous. And what you're referring to, it was The Virginian, which was the first ever 2-hour movie series for television. And they wanted me to take a starring role. And of course, it wasn't very good. So I said, oh, you got to make it better. They said, okay, we will. But the other thing I said was, if you want me to be on it, I want all of the Indigenous parts to be played by Indigenous people. And they said, oh, no. That's too much. Besides, we've got Jews, we've got Italians, we've got Koreans, we've got Filipinos, and our makeup people can turn a dog into a cat. And I said, no, you're not getting it. It's more important and more delicious than just fooling white people. It really can be wonderful. Can you imagine the Sopranos if there were no Italians in it? The Sopranos was great because all the writers, everybody involved understood the culture and brought that additional cultural richness. So this is not a matter of saying identity politics, get out of our way. We're going to play all. It's not that. No, we're trying to improve the movie industry. We're trying to improve the world by the reality of our presence. And we can do that. And I had the backup at the time. We didn't get just any old Indian on the street. No, Jay Silverheels, who played Tonto and who's from Six Nations, and Lois Red Elk, who's from Montana, they were running the Indian Actors Workshop, and I knew it. So I didn't just go in there bragging and mouthing off. I knew that we could fill those roles and not only give other Indigenous people a chance to have a job, but also to make the movie better, which was the point.
But to go back to Sesame Street for a moment, you were the first woman to breastfeed on television. I mean, right now, that seems to be kind of even controversial. But back then, on Sesame Street, and your family was also on Sesame Street.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And regarding nursing on television, I was nursing my baby anyway, just off the set. And so I asked them, they were very sweet and wonderful people and genuinely child and family friendly. So I said, why don't we nurse Cody on TV? And it was so cute the way they did it, big bird's in his nest and he's looking over and he's saying, "What you doing, Buffy?" And I said, "I'm feeding the baby." And he said, "That's a funny way to feed a baby." And it continues from there. So Sesame Street, not only in accepting my idea of having, have you ever done any Native American programming? They were open to it. And breastfeeding as well. They were open to it. And it was not controversial then. But it is now for some reason, and I don't get it. Why are they sexualizing it now? I mean, it's feeding your baby, and it's as cuddly as kissing. It's just the sweetest and most natural thing in the world.
I co-signed when I was breastfeeding my children. I would have to sneak into the bathroom, the dirty bathroom, to do it because I felt so self-conscious. But anyway, I want to draw our conversation to Canada because you were born here, but you've spent most of your life living outside of it. From your vantage point, are things moving in the right direction here in terms of reconciliation?
From my vantage point, yes. Truth and reconciliation is step 1 and step 2. And I see a lot of people moving on from there. Step 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If we don't do that, it's just going to sit here. But I see a lot of people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, moving forward on that. And we're doing it in different ways. Some of us are lawyers, some of us are business people, some of us are artists or musicians or community people or something. But no, we have been ready for a long time to make things better. And what has changed is not so much us, as now there's an audience for the good work that we've been trying to do all this time. I mean, truth and reconciliation, yes, but the residential schools, how horrifying, But I think that, I think Canada is moving in the right direction. I'm not talking about government or any province government specifically. I'm talking about the people ourselves. I see a lot of people understanding, and that in itself is a big step forward. And we all got to move forward in making the world better, and this is just one way to do it.
Well, prior to the Pope's recent apology to Indigenous people for abuses in the country's church-run residential schools, you were calling for him to rescind the doctrine of discovery. He didn't. What was your reaction to that?
Oh, that's not quite right. It's almost right. No, the church in Pope, I love Pope Francis. I think he's great. He has explained that the church has already abandoned it. They're not doing that anymore. So it's not right that us guys be just yelling at him, you got to get rid of it. They already, in their perspective, they've already gotten rid of it. What I want him to do is to lead the world's nations in whose laws the doctrine of discovery is embedded. I mean, don't tell me that we're talking about a doctrine that was written in the 15th century. Ruth Bader Ginsburg used it against the Oneidas in 2005. It's still embedded in Canadian law, and it's still affecting us. It's a burden that no other people in the world, except Indigenous people who were colonized by Europe, have to suffer. So the doctrine of discovery says that if explorers setting out from Europe come upon inhabited lands, unless they're Christian, you're supposed to enslave them and turn their property over to us, the European Church. And it's just horrifying. I mean, who would stick up for slavery today? And yet it's embedded in the laws throughout South America, throughout Central America, every state in the US, throughout Canada, throughout Australia, in Indonesia, even in Scandinavia, wherever it went, it still exists. So I want the church to take real leadership. Talk about being on God's side and doing God's work. I want the church to lead the nations of the world in understanding that we must do we must do away with the doctrine of discovery.
I want to close off our conversation. We have about 5 minutes left. I want to bring it back to songwriting. And you're for your music, you're known for your activism, but I think it's kind of interesting that two of your biggest songs are actually love songs. And you're probably among a very small group of artists to refuse to have your song rights bought out by Elvis Presley. Can you tell us that story?
Oh gosh, I'm glad we have a few minutes because it's kind of a long story. I had given away the rights to Universal Soldier for $1. That's how green I was. The Highwaymen were coming off a huge hit, Michael Row the Boat Ashore, and wanted to put Universal Soldier as the final song for their album that was going to come out next week. So they said, who's the publisher? And I said, what's that, And some guy that my manager knew named Elmer Jared Gordon said, oh, I'll help you. I'm a publisher. You can give me the rights for Universal Soldier for $1. And I signed. Okay, so many years ahead, I had already written Until It's Time for You to Go. Oh, Chet Atkins had recorded it. Sonny and Cher had recorded it. Bobby Darin had recorded it. And now I got a phone call while I was in Nashville from this person that I knew, and he was working for Elvis Presley. He said, Buffy, Elvis just recorded your song, and we're going to have some of that publishing money, honey. And I just laughed, and I said, no. It wasn't Elvis. It wasn't Elvis that I was turning down. It was Elvis's business people, and that's what they did. They were about money and exploitation in this case. So I just said no, and they said, okay, then he's not going to record it. And I said, oh gosh, I'm so sad. So then he recorded it 9 times. He put it in his stage show. He put it in movies, because I've come to find out that it was his love song with his wife Priscilla, Until It's Time for You to Go was. So I said no, not just because I had made that mistake and because, I don't want to share the money. I was also thinking about other songwriters, and it's just not fair for the business people to come in and loot the only thing that songwriters have going for us. So I was kind of sticking up for other songwriters too.
Well, you won an Oscar for another love song that you wrote. What is it, do you think, about songwriting that you're able to capture those feelings of love? Because in the documentary, you said, I'm glad that I was the one that wrote that song.
Yeah, that was Until It's Time for You to Go. But Up Where We Belong was
Up Where You Belong, yeah.
Yeah, Up Where We Belong. Jack Nietzsche, who was the late Jack Nietzsche, who was just a genius film composer. He couldn't come up with a song for the movie that he was scoring, An Officer and a Gentleman. He called me up and asked me if I had anything. And he and a friend of his came over, and I played them, da, 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 da. I played them the whole thing, time goes by, da, 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 and the hook. And then he wrote a little introduction for it. Will Jennings actually wrote the words, and it all turned into an Academy Award-winning song. And so you just never know, some of it's talent, some of it's luck, some of it's business, some of it's who you know, and some of it just happens to be what time it is today. Life can be spontaneous, if you let it.
Well, when you look back at your career, is there anything that you would have done differently?
Not really.
No regrets?
I always tell up-and-coming songwriters to take a business course and to understand the business side of show business. Because so long as you're only the show, somebody else is going to take complete control of the business, and they're not always your friend. So there are wonderful people who can help you with your career, but not everybody is that way. No, I don't think I would have done things differently, because when things went south for me, in the first place, I never expected to last anyway. I just thought I was going to be there for a few months and have one record. But what I did when things were not happening for me was everything else. That was when I could go home and write songs. I could make paintings. I could go to a dance class. I could garden. I could travel. I could go to the reserve and just hang out. I could go 30 degrees north of the Arctic Circle and spend time with the Samis and go dog sledding and live in a teepee with them. And so nobody should ever feel sorry for me that I got my career ditched in certain ways from time to time. I made very good use of the rest of the time.
Well, I'm going to sneak in a question. I know the producer just told me to wrap, but it's not every day that you get to speak to Buffy Sainte-Marie, so I'm just going to take this opportunity to. I get the sense that education is very important to you. What do you hope your legacy to be?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I think what it says in the documentary, they quoted a song called Jeremiah that says, "Some will tell you what you really want ain't on the menu." Don't believe that. Cook it up yourself and then prepare to serve them. And that's kind of what I wish people would get out of my life, my songs, the documentaries or the biographies that have been written about me. I mean, really, all of us who have grown up in what we call Western education, it's only this much. That's only what certain guys want you to know about the world. There's so much more to the world than that. But it's up to you to go and discover it in your own new, unique way. And then once you do, tell the world. That's when you serve them. That's when you serve them. And that's really the fun part, is to see somebody else take your little gift and maximize it beyond your wildest dreams. It's a real thrill.
It's been such a pleasure to speak to you. I just noticed that your nails are blue, and I noticed that it's not that I'm stalking you or anything, but I noticed that you always seem to have blue manicure. Is there anything behind that, or is it just your favorite color?
I just like the color. Every time I go to my manicurist, we discuss another color. No, I just like it. I like it.
Well, twinsies.
See,
I've got blue. Yeah. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, ma'am.
All the best.
Thanks,
all right.
guys.
Bye.
Aloha.
Could so-called tiny homes be a big part of the solution for people without adequate housing in Hamilton? Justin Chandler covers Hamilton Niagara for Ontario Hubs. He recently heard how the experience in Kitchener could offer some answers for the Hammer, and that's where we find him tonight. Welcome, Justin.
Hello.
Let's talk about the Hamilton Alliance for Tiny Shelters. What is it?
So the Hamilton Alliance for Tiny Shelters is a group of, like-minded individuals, some of them from longstanding community organizations in the city, like the Social Planning and Research Council or the Poverty Reduction Roundtable, but also I think people who are more new to this, but who are really keen on the idea of tiny homes, and tiny homes specifically as a solution to help people who are currently living in encampments.
So there is a similar project in Kitchener-Waterloo area. What are tiny shelters meant to do for a city and sort of the fabric of community there?
Yeah, I guess the best way to start is just to sort of look at what we currently have in a lot of places, which is people who, for whatever reason, can't or don't want to get into shelters. There's a lot of valid reasons around that we won't get into right now, but who end up living in tent encampments. And the idea with a tiny homes community is that this could be a better, safer option than that. Encampments are often illegal, so people are sort of on the run from bylaw who are constantly taking down tents and moving them around. The idea with this is that people would have a safe location that they could live while they wait to get into perhaps social housing or get on their feet and be able to get into something more permanent, but where they would be safe and where different social services could actually reach out to and assist them. So it's really sort of saying, let's look at kind of what's currently happening and find something that's better than that.
Okay, so you spoke to a consultant on the Hamilton project. I'm curious, what did he say was the most challenging part of gaining approval for tiny projects and tiny homes? Because we can imagine there's a lot of red tape, a lot of policy that you have to get through.
Mm-hmm. That was Tony D'Amato-Storts, who's just written a book about how to do this. And really, he said the biggest, most difficult thing is actually just finding a place and getting the political will. He said it's not easy to set up one of these communities, but that's not the most challenging part. The most challenging part is finding a place where it's legal to set this up, where you can get it zoned properly, you can get the hookups that you need for electricity, where the neighbors aren't going to be fighting it. So really, he said it's more of a political challenge at this point for Hamilton or for anyone who's trying to set something up at the beginning.
All right, so I know we have some photos of these tiny shelters. Let's take a look at some. This is what a tiny shelter would look like from the outside. Do you know the dimensions of the structure as well?
Yes, 8 by 10 feet.
8 by 10, and so we're looking at one window. Now we do have an entrance, I believe inside. It's also decked out with a mini fridge and a microwave. I found this interesting. The entryway, there was a bit of a conversation about something that I think lots of people don't think about in terms of doors opening in and out. Walk me through that story.
Yeah, Tony was explaining that for a lot of us, we're used to our doors opening inwards. But one of the things that he ended up finding out with a better tent city in Kitchener, where he was a superintendent for a year, was that people actually preferred outswinging doors. And originally they had just done this because they thought it would give people more space inside, but people actually felt it was a lot safer because if someone came and kicked your door or was trying to force their way in, the door is not opening that way because it's going outwards. And so he said this is really a good example of where listening to residents and talking to the people who are partners at the site who are living there actually really helps do this better on sites in the future.
One thing we noted in that second photo was there was a microwave and a fridge, so there is some electricity, but there is no plumbing. And I am curious, for the electricity portion, who pays for that?
That does depend on the model of the site. So some sites are partially funded by cities and partially funded by like the groups that are backing them. So I guess by philanthropy, by donations, community organizations. Some sites are funded by municipalities fully. So that's something that needs to be worked out for each site. But definitely electricity is one of the most important things as far as getting these set up. In Tony's book, he says that water can be brought in. You could have porta potties if you can't get access to like a physical washroom building, but electricity is necessary for heat and for lighting and for entertainment.
All right, and let's look at our final photo. This is a photo, obviously, of the bed, a significant upgrade for a lot of people when we talk about the comparison of a tent to a shelter like this. When we talk about the city and maintaining the shelter, does the city take responsibility on that?
I think that would, again, be up to the model. So for a municipally funded site, presumably the city would be a lot more active in that. But for a site that's being led more grassroots, then I think they would be responsible for keeping it up to code. It's also the case that the residents do a lot of the work. Tony was saying that, the people who live here, these are their homes. So if shoveling needs to be done in the winter, the site superintendent can buy a shovel, but then it's really up to the residents to take care of that. So it's not quite as simple as just like the city coming in and doing everything.
I know when you were talking to D'Amato about sort of this as a solution to homelessness, what did he say about this sort of being, is this where it sort of ends, or is this just the beginning and the start?
He called this a port in the storm. This is sort of a middle. So for someone who's unhoused and who doesn't have access to shelter right now, this would be great. So if a site like this can take 10 or 20 people out of homelessness, or sorry, I should say out of houselessness, give them that roof over their head and give them an opportunity to sort of, catch their breath, get the paperwork that they need in order to apply for social services, maybe be on a wait list for affordable housing. It's really that sort of a safer middle step for people. But he says it's definitely not the solution to ending homelessness writ large. That's going to require a lot more social investment and all sorts of work from various sectors.
Justin, we have about 30 seconds left. I do want to ask you, something that obviously comes up in this conversation is that, not in my backyard type of attitude. And I know that he had some advice in terms of tackling that. What did he have to say?
Well, one of the things he said is that for people who are worried about a site like this, the impact's probably not going to be near as big as they think, that a lot of the things that worry people about having a shelter nearby or having unhoused people nearby aren't going to apply because people are going to be safe within their own community. You're probably not even going to run into them that much. But really, he said the main thing to remember is that just because you don't want someone here, like they're still a member of the community. And they still deserve respect and care and safety. And he said that's a point that's really important to make.
Justin, great story. Really appreciate your time for joining us on the program.
Thank you. Take care.
The agenda this week reflected on the significance of Canada's new king, debated the role of private delivery in public health care, and explored how the opioid crisis is ravaging Northern Ontario. The agenda's Week in Review begins assessing developments in Russia's war in Ukraine.
Sheldon, why don't you bring the map up? And Angela, maybe you could take us through what you see on this map in terms of the developments that have transpired over the past several days, particularly in the eastern part of Ukraine. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be back on your show. So this was very dramatic in the last few days. The Ukrainians have essentially taken most of the area around Kharkiv, which of course is the second largest city in Ukraine, and they've taken villages and small towns that were part of the kind of logistics and transportation hub for the Russian troops, making it much more difficult for them to project force, to resupply. And what you've had is, at least what we've seen in the images that we have, because journalists are actually not allowed in there, are fleeing Russians. They're leaving all their tanks behind. They're leaving the ammunition behind. And so this really is quite dramatic. And then there is another offensive going on in Kherson, which was a town that was taken very early in the war when Russia invaded. That is going more slowly, but it is also happening. It's also a key logistical place. So I think what we can say is that what used to be, let's say 2 weeks ago, looked like a stalemate, now is much more dynamic. The Ukrainians are on the offensive. They are being more successful than people thought. The Russians are fleeing, or as the Kremlin says, they're just regrouping their forces. But I think we have to wait and see whether the Ukrainians can keep the territory that they've taken, what kind of countermeasures the Russians take, including asymmetric responses. We've already seen them take out much of the power grid in a number of cities around Ukraine, until we can say that the Ukrainians have consolidated these gains. But still, it's a very positive sign for the Ukrainians.
Well, those are clearly key questions that you've asked at the end there, which makes me want to ask Jeff Kopstein whether you think this is a genuine turning point in the war.
Well, it depends what we mean by turning point. I mean, they are now 6 months into a 3-day operation, which was supposed to be a blitzkrieg, but it didn't go that way. Then it turned into a war of attrition. So a turning point, the Russians thought the war of attrition would work to their advantage. And this shows that it has not. They appear at this point, at any rate, to be have lost a lot of people, men, have lost, as Angela just said, a lot of materiel. And that's one turning point you could look at. There's yet another turning point, and that is, and Angela also alluded to it, there was a question, and the Ukrainians were under some pressure to do this. Could they actually perform an offensive? And the answer to that, at least preliminarily, appears to be yes. They've gained back some territory. Now, the mother of all turning points would be, is this somehow Putin's Waterloo? And we don't appear to be there yet. I mean, a Waterloo in the sense of Napoleon losing a decisive battle during the Napoleonic Wars, the analogy is apt because Napoleon got so much of his power on the basis of military victory. And Putin himself appeared to have this kind of strongman and undefeatable image. And if he continues to lose at this rate, it can't but hurt him at home. And anybody who's been watching the Russian versions of the agenda, which I've been doing, and I'm sure my co-guests have been doing as well, has seen that things have started to kind of break and change a little bit there in unexpected ways. People like talking heads like us are saying things that they haven't said in a while.
Well, that takes me nicely to Bill Browder, and I want to tap into your knowledge of Russia by asking whether you think, I'm going to ask about a turning point, but in a different kind of way. Is this a turning point in terms of Putin's and/or the Kremlin's ability to spin this back home as an unadulterated success?
Absolutely, it's a turning point. Basically, as everyone else has mentioned, this was supposed to be a 3-day war, in which the Ukrainians were going to welcome Russian troops with open arms and hugs. And it's turned out to be a war where, if you believe the Ukrainian numbers, more than 50,000 Russian troops have been killed, huge amount of equipment has been destroyed. And now all of a sudden, the Russian military is on the run. It's really been a total disaster. And it's really interesting. I guess there's sort of three main audiences for this disaster. One is for the Ukrainian people I mean, this has really improved the morale of the Ukrainian people to see that they could regain this territory. Second, it's very helpful for the Ukrainians asking for help from the United States government and the European Union and everyone else, because the help that we're providing is not being wasted. It's being used very efficiently and very successfully. And then third, and probably most importantly, this is demoralizing for the Russian public. And it's now starting to bubble up above the surface. There, the main talking heads are now discussing who's to blame, and there's starting to become all sorts of little seeds of discontent around Russia, and a lot of people in Russia can tolerate a lot of things, a lot of negative economic repercussions, a lot of dead bodies. But the one thing they can't tolerate is losing. And if Putin is seen to be a loser, they'll take him out in a weekend. And this is, of course, just the beginning of any process that would demonstrate that. But it's something that's so scary that I would imagine Putin is right now coming up with all sorts of retaliations that are going to be very awful and heartbreaking for us to watch going forward, because he can't be seen to be a loser.
What is the crown? The crown is our concept of the state. It's what provides sovereign authority, whether it be the Crown and Council, which is the executive power, the Crown and Parliament, which is the legislative power, or the Crown and the courts, which upholds the king's peace. So even the crown itself, ultimately, even if we were to try to replace it, we would have to replace it with some other concept of the state. Now, when it comes to the person that holds the office of sovereign or their representatives, whether at the federal level or in the provinces, they have a number of what are called reserve powers. And these are understood to be personal prerogatives that they can exercise to uphold the Constitution or fulfill their duties. Most notably, in the Canadian Constitution, the king is limited to two real powers here. The first is the appointment or dismissal of the Governor General. And as you might recall from Julie Payette's time as Governor General, there was some discussion about whether or not the Queen might have to exercise her personal prerogative to dismiss a Governor General. And the second one is Section 26 of the Constitution Act 1867, which has a dual key system, effectively, for the naming of additional senators, where the Queen or the King and the Governor General need to sign off on that decision. Now, other than that, we're talking about the appointing of first ministers, although there's really not much discretion there left anymore. And the one area where there probably is some discretion, as we saw in BC in 2017, is the ability of vice-regal representatives to decline a request to dissolve the legislatures and to invite a new government to take power. So those are really the limited areas.
Now, I remember from school learning about the powers of reservation and disallowance, meaning that if a governor general or a lieutenant governor thought that a law that had been passed by the House of Commons, approved in the Senate, that they didn't like it, they could refuse to sign it and in effect prevent that law from happening. Are those powers still on the books, number one? And number two, can you imagine any Queen's representative actually using those, or King's representative now, forgive me, using those powers nowadays?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Steve, because if you look at the federal provision, it refers to the Queen and Council. So the Governor General would reserve or disallow on the advice of the Queen's Council, which at the time in 1867 would have referred to the British Cabinet. So even though it's still in the books, it seems unlikely that the British Cabinet would ask the Governor General to either reserve or disallow a Canadian act or a Canadian bill, as it were. Federally, it gets a little bit more complicated because you might make the argument, and I do know some people who would say, look, the federal government should still have the ability to reserve or disallow provincial legislation, which is deeply offensive to the Constitution. My own view is that it's probably a spent power, and it would be a crisis if that ever occurred. And by the same token, lieutenant governors in the past have seemed to exercise these powers of their own volition, which is highly problematic. And finally, just to end, there has been some talk of whether or not they can deny royal assent, so leaving aside a reservation and disallowance. Can they simply refuse to sign a bill of their own accord? And that, I would argue, is only for the most extreme of circumstances and should never be discussed as a reserve power that would be used lightly.
Understood. Let's, you know what, Sheldon, middle of page 2, let's bring up this graphic here because I would, let's share some polling numbers here. What kind of a task does King Charles III have ahead for him? Because Angus Reid did a survey. This was back in April, mind you. Now, 5 months ago, 51% of Canadians surveyed said the country should not remain a monarchy. The survey found that while 55% of Canadians supported remaining a constitutional monarchy for as long as the Queen is alive, support for Charles and Camilla dropped to 34%. So this is the task at hand, Carolyn, for the new monarch. He needs to, I guess, establish in the public's mind that he can do the job.
Yes, right now there's a big outpouring of sympathy because King Charles III has just lost his mother. He lost his father, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, last year. So we're seeing the cheering crowds outside of Buckingham Palace, expressions of sympathy from around the world. But once he settles into the job, there's going to be a lot of critical scrutiny. And it's a similar moment in some ways to 1901 when Queen Victoria passed away. And many people simply could not imagine her son, Edward VII, who was 59, and that seemed like a great age at that time, stepping into that role. And he managed to exceed expectations and carved out a role for himself as a diplomat on the European stage. And the new King Charles III has emphasized that he wants to be everyone's king, the Commonwealth realms, the nations within the United Kingdom, the overseas territories, people of all faiths, all walks of life. And he's emphasized from day one, making himself visible, greeting the crowds immediately. There being cameras there for the Accession Council and his first meeting with British Prime Minister Liz Truss. So we're seeing this very strong emphasis on making the crown, the monarchy, and these royal duties accessible to the public from very early on.
Watched the healthcare system deteriorate. I've been in this healthcare system now for 4 decades. I've seen successive deterioration. I think there's no question that the pandemic has shone a light on this, showed the deficiencies in the system. But even before that, we were operating in a situation where most public hospitals were at or above capacity, and we simply need to add real capacity to the system in order to keep up and in order to accommodate the growth in population, the aging that we'll see. I think if one of the best solutions in this is to allow more private operations to provide physical facilities and to attract back to the profession a large number of healthcare workers who have left the profession earlier than they planned because of the stresses induced. And now we're finding that even though we have millions of delayed interventions or investigations, we can't keep up with the new problems that we're facing, let alone address that. We need to have additional capacity. The private sector can provide it. We can pay for it out of the public system. You can present your OHIP card showing that you're an insured person. That OHIP card pays the doctor's fee. There was some negotiation that needs to be done around funding the actual operating costs of those facilities, but it can be done, as has been shown in a lot of jurisdictions in the world. And as Mr. Legault, for instance, in the ongoing election campaign in Quebec has promised to build up to 12 privately owned, privately operated facilities.
I'm going to come back to that in a second. Okay, let me stop you there because you've put your position on the record very well. Dr. Philpott, let me get you in here and say, if the Ontario government decides that it wants to have more private players providing publicly insured services, what would be your view of that?
So, Steve, you know I'm going to slightly frustrate you here because I think that we have to have a nuanced response to this question. I think the question itself can be a bit of a distraction, and we need to define some terms first in terms of what we're talking about when we talk about private healthcare, whether it is private delivery of healthcare or private payment of healthcare. And then, of course, even within private delivery, you've got private for-profit and private not-for-profit. So there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding about what terminology we're using, and I think it's really important to be able to have those conversations. I've told you before, I am not fundamentally opposed to private delivery of healthcare because, of course, I'm a family doctor, and most family doctors in the province, if not, and as well as the country, are private practitioners. In fact, they're private for-profit practitioners, but they have obligations to ensure that for medically necessary care, that has to always be publicly funded and that people can't access care based on private pay for medically necessary services, it has to always be done on the basis of medical need. So I think that it is unhelpful for us to be ideologically entirely opposed to private delivery of care, or ideologically in favor that is going to solve all our problems. I think it is neither the whole solution. There are a whole range of other really important solutions, nor is it something that we absolutely shouldn't be open to discussing.
Okay, appreciate your nuanced take on that. And Natalie Mayer, let's go to you and say, same question. Again, if the Ontario government, in its wisdom, decides it wants to have private players provide more publicly funded services, what would be your view of that?
Well, I think we have to be clear that they are actually already doing it, first off. And second off, I think it's pretty clear what we're talking about. The new thing is that the government wants to hand over money to private for-profit clinics that operate sort of as mini hospitals to do surgeries and diagnostics. They announced that, I think, quite clearly in August. And according to the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario, they actually are already doing it in the last quarter of last year. So the period ending April 1st, they doubled the quarterly payments to the private clinics to increase their surgeries and diagnostics. So that is the for-profit privatization of services that were heretofore offered in our local public hospitals. It's quite different than a family doctor who operates in a group or on their own. These are for-profit companies that run these clinics. And I think the other thing that has to be clear is that we have called all of the for-profit clinics. I mean, they have moved in some parts of Canada more than others to take over public hospital services. And each time we've called them, and we've called them multiple times, we have caught the majority of them, not a small minority, but the majority of them violating the Canada Health Act and charging patients outright for surgeries and diagnostics, as well as selling a whole raft of additional add-ons, medically unnecessary services that they charge money for, because that's how they maximize their profits.
So can I just understand, Natalie?
And they bill patients on top. Sorry.
Can I just understand? So your prime objection to going further down this path is the notion that patients will have to pay out of their own pockets in order to avail themselves of these services. Have I got that right?
I think the biggest fear is that we will not be able to preserve single-tier public Medicare in this province or this country if the Ford government continues with its path of privatizing our hospitals.
Can you give us a sense of why opioid deaths are happening at such alarming rates in Northern Ontario?
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that health disparities are greater in northern communities compared to southern communities. We have greater rates of poverty, homelessness, and as we are seeing with the opioid poisoning crisis, higher rates of substance-related harms. And a very important part of this conversation is the fact that our health outcomes are greatly influenced by social and economic conditions. These are what we call the social determinants of health. They are non-medical factors that influence our health. They include income, education, early childhood development, access to services, to name a few. So when we look to the social determinants of health, we can then begin to understand how issues such as trauma, limited access to services in rural communities, colonialism in the north, and simply stressful life events can then lead someone to substance use initiation, and thus the vicious and dangerous and tragic cycle that we are seeing with the opioid poisoning crisis.
Leanne, Hillary mentioned the social determinants of health. People may be finding ways to cope with their lives because of the things that they have to navigate on a daily basis. It's a tall order to deal with the crisis at hand, and also to address poverty, childhood trauma, being unhoused. To what extent is your jurisdiction able to cope with a crisis, let alone to prevent it?
It's an incredibly important question, and exactly what Hillary mentioned is where public health does need to focus our time and energy. We really continue to strive to work and increase priority in the area of prevention, of ensuring that we have safe, connected, healthy communities, that we're supporting the policies and the processes for early childhood development, that we're looking at housing, we're looking at income, that we're looking at trauma-informed care, and all of the items that really we know impact substance use and lead to this tragic outcome that we continue to see. And you're right, it's challenging in the middle of the crisis that we're seeing to make sure that we're putting that time and energy and that we really continue to see the funding and priority in prevention and upstream measures to really address the social determinants of health and the complex factors that really lead to the crisis that we're seeing currently.
Did the pandemic make the situation worse with the opioid crisis?
Definitely. I think we saw that clearly across Ontario. We know that individuals tended to be using alone more often. We know that support systems were broken or sort of, not available as they had been prior to the pandemic. And so we definitely saw that in the numbers and the tragic losses across the province and across our region, and definitely something that we need to continue to focus on the upstream prevention and also ensure that we have the emergency supports in place to save lives while we're working on the comprehensive approach.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, TVO.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, September 16th, 2022. Monday, we'll consider the Conservative Party's newest tilt towards being a working people's party. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend. And Steve, we'll see you again on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.